So now that you understand what kind of vaccine Sinopharm actually is, everything that comes next suddenly matters a lot more. Because this isn't just another COVID shot with a different logo on the box, it's an entirely different philosophy of protection, and that difference explains both why millions of people trust it and why so many experts remain cautious. You see, when we talk about an inactivated vaccine, we're really talking about an older idea being deployed in a modern crisis. And that sounds reassuring at first, but the real question is whether something familiar is always something sufficient, especially when the virus itself keeps changing the rules. The Sinopharm vaccine, officially known as BBIBP-CoV, was developed in China alongside another Chinese vaccine you might have heard of, Sinovac. And while the two are often lumped together in conversation, they are not interchangeable. They were built differently, tested differently, and ultimately performed differently in the real world, which is why understanding Sinopharm on its own terms is so important. And this is where things start to get interesting, because on paper, Sinopharm looks solid, but when you dig into the details, the story becomes much more complicated. Here's how the mechanism actually plays out inside your body. The virus used in the Sinopharm vaccine is rendered incapable of replicating, meaning it cannot cause infection, but it still looks enough like the real virus that your immune system treats it as a threat. Because of that, your body produces antibodies in response, learning what the virus looks like so that if the real thing ever shows up, the immune system can react faster. That sounds straightforward, but here's the catch. Because the virus is fully inactivated, the immune response it generates is often weaker than what you'd see with newer technologies like mRNA vaccines. And that single detail explains almost everything that follows. Sinopharm is given as a 2-dose vaccine, typically spaced 3 to 4 weeks apart, similar to Pfizer and Moderna. And during its phase 3 clinical trials, it enrolled more than 60,000 participants, which on the surface sounds incredibly reassuring. Larger trials usually mean stronger data, but numbers alone don't tell the whole story, because who those participants are matters just as much as how many of them there are. And when researchers looked closer, some red flags started to appear. More than 84% of the participants were male, nearly all were under the age of 60, and not a single participant had a significant underlying medical condition. That means the very populations we worry about most with COVID older adults, people with chronic illnesses, and those with weakened immune systems, were barely represented at all. So while the vaccine showed an overall efficacy of around 78% in preventing symptomatic infection, that number doesn't necessarily apply to everyone equally, and that uncertainty has followed Sinopharm ever since. But clinical trials are only the beginning, because vaccines don't live in laboratories. They live in real populations, under real conditions, with real variants circulating. And that's where post-approval data becomes crucial. One of the most widely discussed real-world studies came out of Peru during a period when the country was battling a severe wave of infections, driven largely by the Gamma and Lambda variants. This wasn't a small study either. It included nearly 400,000 frontline healthcare workers, people with constant exposure to the virus, which makes the findings especially revealing. In that study, the Sinopharm vaccine showed an effectiveness of about 54% at preventing infection, which is noticeably lower than what was reported in the original trials. But here's the twist, and this is where people often stop paying attention too early. Despite the lower protection against infection, the vaccine was associated with roughly a 95% reduction in COVID-related deaths. And that creates a tension that's hard to ignore, because while fewer people were protected from getting sick, many more were protected from dying. That trade-off raises an uncomfortable but important question. Is a vaccine that primarily prevents death rather than infection good enough in a global pandemic? For some countries, especially those with limited access to ultra-cold storage or advanced healthcare infrastructure, the answer has been yes. Sinopharm can be stored at standard refrigerator temperatures, which makes it far easier to distribute in low and middle income regions. That logistical advantage alone has put it into use across more than 30 countries. However, safety and effectiveness aren't just about logistics, and this is where concerns from global health authorities start to weigh in. The World Health Organization has repeatedly expressed low confidence in the available data for certain high-risk groups, particularly the elderly, pregnant women, and people with multiple medical conditions. Not because there's clear evidence of harm, but because there simply isn't enough high-quality data to be confident either way. And in medicine, uncertainty itself is a risk. To understand why age matters so much here, we have to talk about neutralizing antibodies, because not all antibodies are created equal. Neutralizing antibodies are the ones that actually block the virus from entering your cells, and the more of them you have, the lower your risk of infection and severe disease. A study from Hungary looked specifically at how many of these antibodies were produced after 2 doses of the Sinopharm vaccine, and the results were hard to ignore. Among participants over the age of 60, roughly 25% had no detectable neutralizing antibodies at all. For those over 80, that number jumped to nearly 50%. That means half of the oldest individuals in the study showed no measurable neutralizing antibody response after full vaccination. When researchers compared this to similar data from Pfizer's vaccine, the difference was striking because only about 10% of the oldest age group lacked neutralizing antibodies after Pfizer. That gap alone helps explain why some countries began recommending booster shots with different vaccines for people who originally received Sinopharm. Another important study came out of Sri Lanka, focusing on how well Sinopharm-generated antibodies held up against newer variants like Delta and Beta. In this study, most participants did develop detectable neutralizing antibodies against these variants, which is reassuring, but the levels varied widely. Interestingly, people who had previously been infected with COVID and then vaccinated had antibody levels similar to those who had received both doses of Sinopharm, suggesting that natural infection plus vaccination may provide a stronger immune response than vaccination alone. And this is where the conversation gets even more complicated, because vaccine performance isn't static. It changes depending on age, prior infection, circulating variants, and even time since vaccination. Sinopharm has been fully approved in countries like China and the UAE, authorized for emergency use in many others. And yet it remains unapproved in the United States, not even for emergency use. That doesn't automatically mean it's unsafe, but it does reflect differing regulatory standards and differing levels of confidence in the available data. So when people ask whether the Sinopharm vaccine is good or bad, the honest answer is that it depends on what you're measuring and who you're talking about. It has clearly saved lives, particularly in settings where other vaccines were not available. At the same time, its reduced immune response in older populations raises real concerns that can't be ignored. And that tension between accessibility and optimal protection sits at the heart of the Sinopharm story. Because the real question isn't just how this vaccine performed in the past, but what it means moving forward, especially as new variants continue to emerge and booster strategies evolve. And that brings us to the most important part of this discussion, the part that most people never hear, which is what happens next when immunity starts to fade and the virus refuses to stand still. And this is where the conversation shifts from what Sinopharm did to what Sinopharm can still do, because immunity is not a permanent switch that gets flipped once and stays on forever. It fades, it adapts, and sometimes it fails, especially when a virus keeps reinventing itself. COVID never promised to play fair, and vaccines like Sinopharm were never designed for a finish line that keeps moving. So the real issue now isn't whether Sinopharm worked once, but whether it can keep up. Over time, researchers began noticing a pattern that was both predictable and troubling. Antibody levels after Sinopharm vaccination tended to decline faster than those seen with mRNA vaccines, especially in older adults. That matters because when antibodies drop, the immune system relies more heavily on memory cells, and with inactivated vaccines, that memory response isn't always as robust. So protection against severe disease may linger, but protection against infection quietly slips away. And that creates a dangerous illusion of safety, where people believe they are fully protected long after their immune system has started letting its guard down. This realization is what pushed many countries into difficult decisions about booster shots. Some nations recommended a third dose of Sinopharm itself, hoping that another exposure to the inactivated virus would reinforce immunity. Others took a different path entirely, opting for heterologous boosting, which means mixing vaccine type. People who initially received Sinopharm were later given mRNA vaccines, or viral vector vaccines as boosters, and the results were eye-opening. Antibody levels often surged dramatically, sometimes even exceeding those seen in people who had only received mRNA vaccines from the start. That outcome revealed something crucial. Sinopharm may function well as a foundation, especially where access to vaccines is limited, but it may not be enough on its own for long-term protection in a world full of variants. Delta exposed those weaknesses, Omicron magnified them, and future variants are unlikely to be more forgiving. This doesn't mean Sinopharm failed, but it does mean it was built for a different phase of the pandemic, one where speed and accessibility mattered more than peak immune performance. Another layer to this story is public perception, because vaccines don't just work biologically, they work socially. In many regions, Sinopharm became the default option, sometimes the only option, which meant people took it not out of preference but necessity. That reality shaped trust in complex ways. When breakthrough infections began appearing, especially among older adults, confidence wavered. People didn't just ask whether the vaccine worked, they asked whether they had been given the best possible protection or simply the most available. And yet, there's an uncomfortable truth here that often gets ignored. In a global emergency, a moderately effective vaccine delivered early can save more lives than a highly effective vaccine delivered too late. Sinopharm reached countries that would have otherwise waited months or years for alternatives. It filled a gap at a critical moment, and in doing so, it prevented healthcare systems from collapsing under the weight of uncontrolled outbreaks. That impact doesn't show up neatly in antibody charts, but it's real nonetheless. Still, science doesn't operate on gratitude, it operates on data. And as more real-world evidence accumulated, the limitations became harder to overlook. Elderly populations consistently showed weaker immune responses. People with multiple medical conditions remained underrepresented in trials. Pregnant women were left with more questions than answers. None of this proves harm, but it does force caution, especially when safer or more effective alternatives are available. This is why many health authorities quietly shifted their messaging. Instead of presenting Sinopharm as a complete solution, they began framing it as part of a broader strategy. Get vaccinated now, boost later. Reduce deaths first, refine protection second. That shift matters because it acknowledges both the strengths and the shortcomings of the vaccine without pretending one cancels out the other. What's often misunderstood is that vaccine comparison isn't about ranking winners and losers. It's about matching tools to circumstances. mRNA vaccines may offer stronger immunity, but they require infrastructure, cold storage, and supply chains that aren't universally available. Sinopharm, with its refrigerator-level storage and established manufacturing processes, fits into systems that would otherwise be left behind. That trade-off is uncomfortable, but in public health, perfection is rarely an option. As the pandemic enters its later stages, the role of Sinopharm continues to evolve. In some countries, it has been phased out entirely. In others, it remains a primary vaccine supplemented with boosters from different platforms. And in a few regions, it still stands as the main line of defense. Not because it's ideal, but because it's what's there. That reality forces us to confront a difficult question about global equity, one that goes far beyond any single vaccine. So when people ask whether they should trust Sinopharm, the better question might be whether they understand it. It is not a miracle solution, nor is it a failure. It is a traditional vaccine deployed in an unprecedented crisis, performing exactly as that combination would predict. It reduces deaths reliably, prevents infections inconsistently, and protect some populations better than others. Ignoring any part of that truth leads to confusion, fear, or misplaced confidence. And perhaps the most important lesson from Sinopharm has nothing to do with antibodies at all. It reminds us that vaccine science does not exist in isolation. It is shaped by politics, supply chains, urgency, and human behavior. A vaccine can be scientifically sound and still insufficient. It can save lives and still need improvement. Those ideas are not contradictions. They are realities. Because the pandemic was never just about stopping a virus. It was about making imperfect decisions under impossible pressure. Sinopharm is a snapshot of that moment in history, a reminder of how far we've come and how much nuance gets lost when complex science is reduced to simple headlines. And as new vaccines are developed and new variants emerge, that nuance may be the most valuable immunity of all.